Hello, welcome to my presentation of Go Down Moses, the Bear. It's by William Faulkner, and I'm presenting it. Okay, so first, The Bear. It's a book by Faulkner, or it's in Faulkner's book Go Down Moses, which is actually a collection of short stories that follow the same general characters that radiate around the McCaslin family. This also includes some slaves that share like the same bloodline. However, the bear is specifically centered around Isaac McCaslin. So he is the uniting voice, and he really brings all the stories together, interlacing them. In some ways, he reckons with his legacy, and also his inheritance. And even though each story is technically separate, in Go Down Moses, all the themes and characters do link together. Okay, so now let's talk about the themes. So I read the whole entire book just to see what the uniting themes were, but it ended up that specifically, there were themes throughout the book that were pretty similar, but I'm just looking at the bear specifically. And I found most strongly the themes of slavery, inheritance, which is honestly sometimes seen as in patrimony, not only like land inheritance, but how fathers interact with the story. And also nature and man's desire to conquer it. So, starting with the first theme. So, Sam's father, who is a character in The Bear, he's basically a slave that was working in the bear hunt, and then he just dies. But he's an interesting character because he's 1/8 black. He was sold into slavery, and he's still shackled, metaphorically and literally, because of his perceived race. And so I want to talk a little bit about the one drop rule, and racial inequality relating to this. Because Sam is a great example of the racial discrimination based on this rule. So basically, the one drop rule is one drop of someone who's black's blood makes that person black. So in situations where there's a slave owner and there's a slave, it's beneficial for the slave owner because that means that your slave, even if you are the father, still has to be your slave. So basically, you're getting a slave for free by having sexual relations with your slaves. I hope that makes sense, but I think it's important in this story because it kind of reveals an interlacing theme that goes also through slavery is also inheritance, and how slavery is kind of, it's not really perceived explicitly as unjust, although it's definitely shed in that light. But it's kind of revealed as flawed through this one drop rule and the fact that Sam is just 1/8 black and he's still shackled just based on his race. Okay, next, Isaac McCaslin indicates his family's history of racial exploitation that created his wealthy inheritance. So he actually ends up saying that his family's cursed because of the way that they've benefited off of slavery, and not only his family, he also references slaves, which is interesting. But basically he's saying the South is cursed because of slavery, and that's interesting because it also relates back to the idea of man's habit to try to conquer things, and so slavery is almost like a tool that man uses in order to conquer. And another example of slavery is Carruthers McCaslin is illustrates that these interrelationships are happening. However, the mixed race relationships obviously were not given legitimacy based on the one drop rule. So this is kind of expanded on slavery. South is Cursed, already explained that. Also, this kind of idea was in the story was most explained, I think, in the ledgers, when Isaac's looking back through them and his eyes are kind of being open to that. The first example in the ledgers I can think of is the relationship with Zach and Molly Beechams. And then they kind of have an affair. Zach is a slave owner, Molly is a slave. And Zach actually ends up having a son, Roth Edmonds, and Molly takes care of Roth, which is interesting because the relationship between them obviously had a different power dynamic. So, I mean, it is possible that, like, the story's trying to hint that Molly possibly was in love with Zach or something was happening there, but obviously there's exploitation happening. So even though Molly had a relationship with Zach and took care of Roth, Zach's son, she still is almost powerless, and she has to ask in the end of her life for white men, specifically Roth, to give her money to bury her grandson, which is kind of reveals another way slavery interacts in the story, and how it kind of shows these human-like characters that are not treated as humans by the other characters. A quote of this that kind of reveals another aspect of slavery is October 3rd debit, Theophilus McCaslin, $165, mule $100. So this kind of shows that the slaves were basically seen as like animals that they were to buy. So they did have relationships, but it's important to remember that the author kind of portrays these relationships as like hard for both parties, even though the moral responsibility, I think, is obviously on the slave owner. But I think it's interesting because it doesn't really expose the exploitive nature that I think should be in the story. And I just wanted to mention that because that was something that bothered me throughout reading, and how the slave owners were portrayed almost sympathetically. Okay, next theme, inheritance. So repudiation is a word that was used a lot to accentuate inheritance. It's mostly seen on 243 when Isaac says, "I can't repudiate it. It was never mine to repudiate. It was never father's and Uncle Buddy's to bequeath, to repudiate, because it was never grandfather's." And then he goes on to say that Ikemetobe's claim on the land was not valid as well. Like, the land was never any of theirs, therefore inheritance is useless because no one ever owned the land. Let's see, inheritance is also kind of related to slavery, because the slaves were not given inheritance rights at all. And this is specifically revealed on page 249. So inheritance continued. So this is kind of related to patrimony, and how characters in the books who are father figures are often not the father. So it's often the cousin or the uncle who's raising the young character who thinks of them as a father figure. So I think this is kind of this narrative is exposing that. And then race and inheritance are presented when Isaac finds the old ledgers and finds the lengths gone to cut black children out of the family inheritance, and black children just like any child that has one drop of black blood. And a quote that shows this is on page 256, and it said, "He made no effort either to explain or obfuscate the $1,000 legacy of the son of an unmarried slave girl to be paid only at the child's coming of age, bearing the consequence of the act, which there was still no definite, incontrovertible proof that he acknowledged, not out of his own substance, but penalizing his sons with it, charging them a cash forfeit on the accident of their own paternity." So basically what it's saying is he had an affair and he has sons, and he's saying you're not going to get any inheritance until you come of age, and he actually is charging them a cash forfeit for the accident of their own paternity, so for his own relationships with the slave. Okay, next theme is nature. So the bear obviously is a metaphor for nature, and it's wild freedom. It's almost invincibility. The bear is shot many times, seems not to be affected by that. It's limping around because it was caught in a bear trap, but it got free, and just is a little bit hurt. And they cannot kill the bear for whatever they seem to do. Boone, who is a kind of crass character in this book, ends up killing Old Ben, which is the bear. And he's kind of a metaphor for man's greedy nature and conquering the South. And they interact really interesting in kind of the death of Old Ben. So Boone is written as incapable and greedy. This is mostly seen in the last image where Boone is fixing his gun, and there's squirrels surrounding him, and he's fixing his gun hurriedly. Isaac comes by, and Boone yells at him. He says, "Don't touch the squirrels, those are my squirrels," and he's trying to fix his gun. So it kind of shows that he's greedy, though he thinks he owns the squirrels. Those are his to shoot. But at the same time, he's kind of incapable because his gun is broken, and he's not able to shoot these squirrels. And then another thing to mention, just in the beginning of the story, Isaac is checked out by the bear, which kind of first opens Isaac's eyes to the almost wild gaze of nature, and the mysterious unknowable of nature. Then something I just also wanted to mention really quick is Old Ben eats horses. So Major Despain actually criticizes the wild animal for breaking rules, because he's expecting the animal, the bear, to hold up to the same rules that slaves must hold up under the white man, to respect the white man. Okay, so structures just last. All of these stories emphasize a patchwork of Isaac McCaslin's family, creating stitching and framing that doesn't fade into the background, but instead makes up the quilt. So I think this is very important to see. Even though these stories are technically separate, they all kind of weave together in an almost coming-of-age climax in The Bear that's centered around Isaac McCaslin. Okay, thank you so much.